before we go back to the practice, are there any questions about this practice, stillness in motion, that we're doing today?
I don't really understand the difference between the observing the mind and the combination that we make today, because if I observe the mind, I observe it from the awareness, don't I?
Very good question. I was hoping someone would ask that question. Is there a difference between... The question is basically, is there a difference between the stillness in motion practice and the practice we did 2 days ago, observing the mind? Yes and no.
No.
Yeah, 2 days ago, yeah, observing the mind, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially the same practice. We're observing thoughts, emotions arise and pass and rise and pass. The only difference being today is that we're more explicitly aware of the awareness itself. And the advantage with that can be the mind is more open and spacious. That by being more explicitly aware of the stillness, that helps to provide a little bit of an anchor for observing the thoughts. So some of you may have found it was a bit easier to observe the thoughts today than 2 days ago. Because often when we try to observe the thoughts, our mind is a bit like this, and some thought comes and we sort of go. But essentially it's the same practice, and when you get deeper into the practice, it is the same practice. Mm-hmm. And the other thing with this is what we introduced today was this sort of sliding scale, meaning particularly as if in the early stages of this practice, when we're really getting caught up a lot, we can move down and be more focused on that stillness and less on the movement, so to help us to anchor us. Whereas if we didn't have that 2 days ago, then we just sort of got swept away. We didn't have that sort of possibility of anchoring, apart from going right back into the breath. So that also provides a little bit of a benefit in the early stages of this practice. Yeah, second question?
And about in the awareness,
mm-hmm.
I know that what to do is not the question, but you always say, imagine that the where is sky and the thoughts are clouds and things like that.
That's an analogy that's often
and
used.
Imagine is not meditation.
No, that's right.
How to reach the
Well, I think in that practice I didn't say imagine that. I mean, I used that in my explanation to try to get some idea of what the practice is. And that's often the case with many explanations in Buddhism. You use some sort of analogy to sort of get some idea about it. But of course, in this resting in awareness, we're not doing that by visualizing the mind like the sky. I mean, if that helps initially to get into the practice, okay. But I mean, that's not the practice. You know, just like labeling thoughts and emotions is not really part of the practice, but it can help us to get into the practice. So yeah, this visualization is not really the practice, but there was a question down the front.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure you answered it, but it may have been the first question. I don't think I understand the difference between mindfulness and stillness.
Mindfulness and stillness.
Yeah, to me, they're with the sliding scale to go between motion and
motion
movement.
and stillness.
No, movement and stillness I get.
Right.
But mindfulness for me is kind of still. It is stillness. Sometimes you'll have movement in it, but being mindful.
Remember here when we use the word mindfulness, it's a mental factor. It's our ability to hold the object. Maybe you're talking about awareness, the function of being aware.
The quote that you had read, it was in
That which observes is mindfulness.
Yeah.
And so mindfulness is what we are using to hold the object.
And what's stillness then?
Stillness is a quality of awareness that we notice when the object is awareness, the mind itself.
Okay, so maybe the stillness part was I'm not able to really get there very well. So for me, I had to keep trying to find a way to sort of tease myself back into it.
Yeah,
Because I didn't struggle 2 days ago. I could do the watching my mind
Sure,
fairly well.
Sure.
But sitting in stillness, that just...
Right. Remember when I say stillness, it doesn't mean we have to make the mind still. We don't want to try and do that. That's not going to work. That's not the practice. That's not any practice, trying to make the mind still. So the reason I often use this word stillness is that when we say just rest in awareness, because it's not really an object, often people sort of, where is this awareness? But then if you say rest in stillness, often people, it's easier for people to notice, because that's a quality of awareness, that awareness is still. So often people find it a little bit easier to rest in that experience rather than looking for this awareness wherever it is. So again, stillness is just a quality of awareness. So when I say rest in awareness, in stillness, it just means know that you're aware. Same. And again, stillness is something that's there even when there are thoughts, because awareness never moves. Awareness itself. Like the sky never moves, but there's a lot of clouds moving in the sky. So even if there's a lot of clouds moving, there's still the sky there that's not moving. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think. I think I just struggle with it, which is fine.
Yeah, these sorts of practices, we just have to get into them and experience, and then it becomes better. Yeah.
So stillness, awareness, sky, it's מילים עודפות?
Synonyms?
Yes.
Sky.
No, sky is an
Analogy for awareness.
For awareness and for stillness.
Yeah. And stillness is a quality of both the sky and awareness. It's a quality.
Which quality else, like another quality that the awareness has?
Is knowing. Clarity. Knowing, clarity.
Okay. Knowing, clarity and stillness? Okay.
Question down the back.
Yes. How the scale that you...
The sliding scale? Yeah.
You go from the right to the left, up and down.
Up and down. There was no up and down.
No, the gaze. When you look, you say up and down. Up and down.
Oh, the gaze. Oh,
Up
okay.
and down.
Sure.
Yeah. How you bring this to any moment in the life? And what is the four? What is the four? Can you explain more about the four? The signal, the manifest, in a little word.
Actually, in the next session, at the beginning of this evening session, I want to bring in a practice of what we're doing with this in daily life. It's called open awareness. But I'll explain more about that in the next session after dinner.
Okay.
So that's how we bring this into daily life.
And can you explain the four few words about the four, the signal, the manifest?
Oh, these ones.
Yeah, few words.
Right. Yeah. This is just one presentation of describing the stages of progress in this practice. That here, this first stage single pointed is when we're able to simultaneously be aware of stillness and movement. That's the first stage. And that'll take effort to do this. And the more we practice it, the easier it becomes. And then it really starts flowing and it becomes much effortless, nearly. That's the second one. And if we keep practicing and our mind becomes more relaxed, stable, clear, more focused, then, as I use that analogy of the threshold, the mind starts going down, 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 more subtle. And then as it goes down like this, and it gets more a deeper level, the sense faculties start to shut down because you're so focused. And then the coarse mind also shuts down because it's becoming more subtle. When that happens, that's third one. And then the next step is we move into that subtle level of mind. We said coarse, subtle, very subtle. When we move there, that's actually shamatha, and that's the fourth one.
The second is when you get confused, or you just realize what's happened.
No, the second one is when this becomes really easy, and you don't have to put a lot of effort to do stillness in motion. It really is just flowing.
True.
It's flowing very well.
Number three?
Two.
Two.
I had a bit frustrating experience this morning with
Right.
meditation because your specific instructions were to focus on emotions.
Well, emphasize emotions.
Emphasize,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just, yeah.
And then what happened is that I started to label my thoughts. So I had a thought, and then on the first thought, I thought to myself, okay, you have to emphasize feelings, like emotions.
Right.
So I was thinking, what kind of emotion stands behind the thought that I had?
Mm-hmm.
And then I labeled fear and shame.
Sure.
And then it made me sad, and it almost brought tears to my eyes to think that those are the emotions standing behind my thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I also labeled sadness.
Good. Good.
And then I thought, well, this sadness wasn't there before I thought about the feelings.
But maybe it
behind my
was.
thought. I don't know, but it made me think maybe I'm doing this exercise wrong by bringing emotions instead of observing them.
Well, of course, in this practice, we're not really trying to create emotions. Although, again, in the beginning stages, to get into the practice, if you are completely lost, as we saw a couple of days ago, what you can do to get into the practice, you could just generate thoughts every so often and just look at them, just to start the practice. So also with emotions, if you're sitting there and you're not noticing anything, you could just generate a few emotions just to start to be able to observe them. But of course, that's not really part of the normal practice. But you could do that at the very beginning just to get into the habit of watching emotions, but then you need to let that go and just observe whatever emotions are there. And a little bit what you were doing, I think, there was already moving a little bit into Vipassana, is that when something comes up, then you start to investigate, why did that get there? What was behind it? So that's a good exercise, but that's more Vipassana. So in Vipassana, that's one of the things we can do, is to investigate things like, where did this come from? Why is it here? What are the conditions that led to this? This is all valid type of investigation in Vipassana practice. But here in Shamatha, we really don't want to do too much of that because we're going out of Shamatha mode and into Vipassana mode. So if you notice that questioning coming up, just observe the questioning. Don't follow it.
This is more general about practice, not specifically to the shamatha
Sure.
practice. The noise was very, very challenging for me this morning. And is that just something that gets, like, do you get better at that? Like, as you get more experience, do you just not care if there's,
Yeah.
like, I could barely
Exactly.
maintain it for
Yeah,
more than
exactly.
a minute or two.
Yeah. A couple of things to mention on that. One is, of course, when we're at home doing some meditation practice, particularly as a beginner, we want to try and find a quiet place. Because the reality is, particularly as a beginner, noise is a big distraction. And often, not only is it a distraction, but often as a beginner, we fight with it. We go, and that makes it even worse. So what I recommend, of course, is find a quiet place to meditate. If you don't do that, I think I already mentioned, I really recommend noise-cancelling headphones. I've got a pair. I've got them upstairs, in fact. And so in between sessions, when I'm up there and there's some noise outside, I put them on and meditate. So very helpful. So that's one thing. If you are somewhere where there is a lot of noise, let's say you're at home and normally it's okay, but on a particular occasion, the neighbour's banging away or there's some roadworks or whatever, you've got a couple of options on what to do. If the noise is really, really loud, like it's hurting your ears, then probably stop meditating because it's not going to work. But if it's not that loud, what you can do, of course, one thing is that can be a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? That's the next bit. But that can be a, what's the word I'm looking for? That can be a check to see where we are in the practice. No? Because often if we really have very quiet place, and usually we're meditating quite well, we might think, oh yeah, I'm really quite advanced meditator. And it's only when something out of ordinary comes that we go, oh, actually. So it can actually be, in that sense, a little bit helpful to realise sort of where we really are. We're not sort of way up here in our practice. So that's one thing. But another thing is then, and so then in that case, is as best we can just come back. But if it's really very persistent, then what we can do, particularly if we're doing it's like a shamatha practice, is whatever the object we're using, shift to that noise. Use that noise as the object of shamatha for the rest of the session. So then you've got an object, and also it's going to help us not to develop aversion to noise. Because if we turn to it, it's helpful, it's useful. So then if we do that occasionally, it means then later if noise comes, we won't go, oh, go away. So that's what I recommend. If it's really very persistent, I mean, if it's super loud, it's hurting your ears, then, you know. But if not, then, and it's really pulling your attention, then just shift your attention to that. Use that as your object for the rest of the session.
Even if it's inconsistent noise?
Yeah, I mean, as long as it's, I mean, if it's a noise every 5 minutes, then we wouldn't know. But I mean, if it's, some of the noises can be it can be a lot of things going on. But if it's pretty well constantly there, then good, because we can just observe all that different noise. So shift to that as your object for the rest of the session.
What a missed opportunity this morning was.
There we go. See, there we go. And also. That's why a little bit this morning I at one point asked, check your emotions, your reactions. Because I knew some of you would be going, noise. You know?
I'm just thinking, comment that there are two types of stillnesses that may be confusing. When we're observing the mind, there's the mind in motion. And when it settles down, it might be like, no thoughts appearing to us, and then it seems like it's quiet, like it's still.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the stillness of resting in awareness, which, in a sense, it's not that it's separate, but it's different. When you're building the mind, it's like out there. You see the quiet mind, but it's out there. But the awareness when you're resting in awareness it's the awareness, the awareness itself, which is not separate from the motion or the stillness. So it's bringing together more the nature of the mind and and whatever is arising in the mind. So in that sense, I'm saying it might be a little confusing in the sense, what's the difference between observing
and I think
mind and
exactly, and I think we can go back to the analogy of the sky. You know, if we're observing the sky and the clouds, and it's just full of clouds, it's just movement. But then when the clouds part, there's sky, which is stillness. No. Or in the practice of resting in awareness, you're being the sky. Then there's stillness there, regardless if there's lots of clouds. But it's good to notice that. But I mean, of course, it's not any different. But I think experientially, it seems one is more objective stillness and one is more subjective stillness. But of course, there's no subject-object duality. So, but I think this is what you're highlighting.
But here, it's actually bringing it closer together. When you're observing the mind, there's the subject and the object. But here, it's coming. You see the dependence instead of the.
Yeah, sure.
But there is identification with the awareness. Like I am awareness suddenly.
Right. So the question is, well, there's identification with awareness. I mean, we have grasping to all sorts of things. But remember, this is a shamatha practice. So if we're identifying as awareness in this practice, doesn't matter. In Vipassana practice, then we go, am I really awareness? Is that really me? That's a Vipassana practice. That's investigating that is interesting. But remember, here we're doing shamatha, and sometimes what people do is when they're doing this sort of observing, at some point they go, well, who's the observer? But to entertain that question in this practice is not the right time. That's the right time to do that is when we're doing Vipassana practice. Then we ask questions like, who's the observer? Am I awareness? Is that really me, awareness? And questions like this.
It's like the sensation also when I have all my body sensations. It's like I'm sensations. You understand? So it's like immediate identification is coming up.
And that's what we do all the time. Is that
like I am not the body. I'm sensation.
Exactly, and we are constantly identifying ourselves with some aspect of our body and mind. Constantly. And then in Vipassana practice, then let's check that out. Are we any of these things we're identifying with or not? But that's Vipassana.
I'm waiting. Day nine.
About there's like we practice the equanimity about people.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some kind of practice we can do for emotions? Not having so much aversion towards pain, emotional pain and attachments.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly this practice here, observing the mind. Is that's what we're doing, is we are not reacting, because that's what we normally do. No?
But can we make it even more like fighting against that aversion?
You can put it as
No, because if you do not want to fight against aversion, you do not want to fight against aversion. That's like throwing petrol on the fire.
But in a way, it's what we did when we practiced the equanimity towards difficult people.
No, we didn't. We didn't fight with that. We developed an accurate perspective.
Yeah.
Didn't we? And so here we're developing an accurate perspective by just observing and not identifying. Because the inaccurate perspective we have now is we identify with that and get caught up in it. So if we can step back and watch and see that emotions are objects appearing in the mind, then that's a correct perspective, and then they're not sticky, they can't do anything to us. It's only when we wrongly identify with them and get caught up in them, that's when they harm us. So we don't want to fight with them. That's going to make it worse.
Yeah.
So just step back and watch. And that's what we're doing in the Shamatha practice.
I heard a teaching about that we can stand back and watch with good eyes.
Good eyes.
Good eyes, like we add a little bit compassion to ourselves when we see all this. And it's helped to see yourself with so many emotions that you don't like.
Yeah. In fact, it's once we can really start to step back and we start to see all this same stuff coming up, it gets a bit sort of comical. You know, we sit there going, oh, not that again. You know, we don't take it seriously anymore because we just see it's just pathetic. And we're not getting caught up in it. And it's really, actually, it can be quite funny sometimes when this same stuff comes up and we're going, no?
This is nice angle to see that.
No, that's right. So that's a sign that we're really not getting caught up, that we're really stepping back and we're just watching. And it's just like a comedy. It's a movie. It's like a comedy.
But in the beginning, you need to see...
In the beginning, it's like serious. It's like a drama. It's like a big drama because we're getting caught up in it. But if we can step back, it's just.
But because we are so judgmental on ourselves, I think to put a little bit compassion in this view, it's good, or humor,
of course.
That's helped me also.
Sure.
This is not a question, it's just more, for me it felt like I was on drugs, which made me laugh. Like there was a hint of it where I was like, this is like being schizophrenic. It's hilarious. And
It is. I mean, really.
I could only have those thoughts when I was
Exactly.
drugs,
I mean,
and
really.
was like, wow, okay.
I mean, it really is like it's like amazing. All this garbage coming up. You know?
It's crazy.
I mean, it's crazy. It is crazy.
Could it be that, for example, like when you read a book, right? I find that I'm going through like a similar process. Like when I'm reading, like usually I have images, and when I'm doing meditation, something very similar happens.
Sure.
And one of the things that also happens is that I'm going through essays that I myself sort of compose as I meditate. And then I was wondering whether maybe a habit of the mind, like to read, might influence the way you can do meditation.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. I mean, of course, sure. I mean, depending on the sorts of habits we have and the dispositions we have, then the flavour of these things coming up will be very different, of course. And you'll notice that in certain periods, if you start to do certain things that you didn't normally do, then that may reflect in the types of things that come up in the meditation, of course.
Does this work impact your dreams?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, the question is, does this sort of practice have an effect on dreams? Of course.
What is the effect?
Because I can have all sorts of
Because
effects.
I've had really weird dreams the last few
Yeah. In fact, I mean, in this practice, I mean, okay, a couple of things to say here. One is, in general, if we're doing this sort of shamatha practice and our mindfulness is getting better, then often it's easier for us to connect with dreams, to remember them and so forth. That's one